Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, it's really great to see all of you out tonight and being able to visit with each other and come here to a good occasion tonight. I want to welcome to you tonight the 9th Annual Tony Wyack History Festival. And this festival is sponsored by Washburn Heritage Association and the Washburn Area Historical Society. It's made possible by a grant from the Washburn Community Education Foundation. I'm Dora Kling, a founding board member of the Washburn Heritage Association. And if you have any ideas for future presentations or you'd like to give a talk, just speak to one of the sponsoring board members. Please feel free to linger afterwards. And after the presentation, enjoy some refreshments back there that are provided, or get a drink at the bar. And there's also a table set up there with some of Kevin's CDs and books that you could purchase. He's written 5 books, and my favorites are the ones of the children's stories. It's about his brother and about his sister. And his sister Laura is at the table back there, and you can ask her if all those stories about her are really true. His newest CD is one with the Minneapolis Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra. He tells the stories that go with the music, and that's another CD that's a favorite of mine. So also, I want to thank Laura for driving Kevin here from Minneapolis, and Jan Lee for helping to get Kevin to Duluth tomorrow, to catch his bus to get him home in time to catch his plane for his storytelling in Memphis, Tennessee on Thursday. But we have him right here with us tonight. So tonight, I am delighted to present our speaker and my son, Kevin Kling.
Thanks, Mom. I always wanted to say that. It is really great to be here. And it's really a great opportunity for me to do something I don't really get to do. I tell stories, but I don't get to really reflect on where they come from, what they're about, and the region that we live in. It's so rich in stories. So I wanted to go back, and I remember a couple of months ago, I'm on an airplane. I'm flying, it was from North Dakota, and a guy was leaving the Bakken fields, and he was getting home to Tennessee. And he's sitting next to me, and he says, we were talking, and I found out he was, working in oil, and he says, what do you do? And I said, I'm a storyteller. And he said, well, isn't that a dying art? And I said, yeah, but it's been trying to die for 4,000 years. It's true. I mean, but it just hangs in there because we need it. We're storytelling creatures. It's been said we spend the first half of our lives running away from home, the second half of our lives trying to get back to home. And by the looks in this room, I think we're mostly on the second half of that journey. So yeah, we're heading back home. We're trying to find what is home, where is home, what is it, and that's where our stories really come in. How do our stories connect us to home? I remember Mom and Laura and I, we were in Scotland a few years ago. Mom said, I want to go to Scotland and Ireland, where we're from, and so we did. And I have to tell you, if you ever get the chance, I mean, to go to the land where we're from with your mom, it's one of the greatest things. So I've been telling everybody, if you ever get the chance to go to Ireland with my mom, do it. But while we were in Scotland, it's like, if you've ever been to the country where you're from, it's like it runs through you vertically. Something happens where you know you're on your clay. Your clay connects. And this is what stories do to me. stories, and I tell people in workshops, I say, go back to the stories where your people are from. Go find, where you're from, and those stories will connect you to your DNA, to your ancestors, in a way nothing else really will. And that's why I'm connected to Irish stories, some of the Scottish stories I'll tell tonight. And a lot of these stories came over with the people that came over across the ocean to this country. And so I'll be getting into a few of those stories that helped us through the long winters, through some of the hardest stretches, through things that really challenged our people. When did we need to go back and dig into our DNA to those survivors that we're connected with? And I want to start with one story that made it over that I came across, and I've always wanted to tell this story, but I never have. I've never had the opportunity. And it's about a character called Ashen Pater. And Ashen Pater, he's from Norway, but he's this guy, he's like Cinderella, Cinderella. Well, he's Ashen Peter. So he's a cut of the same mold. And Ashen Peter came from this town in the south of Norway. And this town, it was so beautiful when it was born that Odin and Freya and Thor got together and they said, we got to do something special for this town. Of course, Odin said, oh, we got to give them wisdom. Wisdom. And then Thor said, no, let's give them all kinds of wealth. And Freya said, no, why don't we give them happiness? Because then they won't care about the other two. So they decided, okay, we'll give them happiness. So this town was always happy. The people were always really happy. And they never knew why, and they couldn't afford to find out. So this town was full of happy people. Probably the happiest person was Ashen Peter. And Ashen Peter was the bell ringer of this town. He'd get up in the morning, and he'd ring the bell, and everyone, oh, it's morning. Oh, even better, it's raining out. What a great day. And then they'd go to work. Hooray, work. We love work. And so they'd go to work, and he'd ring the bell at lunchtime. Lunchtime already? Where is this day going? And they'd have their lunch. Oh, God, sauerkraut, my favorite. And they'd eat their sauerkraut, and then they'd go home, and he'd ring the bell one more time when it was time for dinner. Oh, dinner already. This is great. And then at night sometimes, he would ring the bell to keep the trolls up in the hills. Because trolls think that a ringing bell is Thor's hammer, and they're afraid of it, so they stay away. See, this town had long ago become Christian, but you want to ring the bells just in case. It's like buddies of mine that go fishing, they always kiss the minnows before dropping them in. And you go, are you guys superstitious? And they go, no, we just don't want to jinx it. So this is the same with the ringing the bells. So he was the bell ringer. Well, there was one person that was very unhappy, and that was the priest. And he didn't come from that town, so he didn't really get it. And he could not stand happy people. In fact, bad day hung on this priest like a dog on a sock. I mean, it was just like bad day all around him. And he couldn't even stand to see happy people. So when he'd pass happy people, he'd lower his head just so he didn't have to look at them. And so he was constantly running into people. Well, this was getting to be a problem. So the people wrote the king, and they said, King, this priest, we really are worried about him. He's very unhappy, and it's not fitting in, and he's running into people. Running into people? Said the king, we can't have that. We can't have a priest running into people. He says, you send that priest to me, and if I can't cheer him up, I'll give him something to cry about. So the priest gets his letter. He'd come and see the king. Well, the priest knows right away, this isn't going to be good. You don't just go see the king. This is not going to. So he goes to Ashen Peter and he says, Ashen Peter, the king wants me to visit, and I already know why. He wants to throw me a big party, and we're going to eat and drink all night. It's going to be great. But I'm getting a little bit older now. I mean, midnight, 9 o'clock's the new midnight for me about now. And he said, why don't you go in my place? Ashen Peter says, I've got to ring the bell. The priest says, well, I'm a priest. If anyone knows about bell ringing, it's me. He says, I can ring the bell in your place. Ashen Peter says, I'm not so sure I should go. The priest goes, okay, look, if you don't go and in my place, then the Lord above will know that you didn't do something for the church, and things could turn out bad for you. Well, says Ashen Peter, thank you, priest. I almost made a horrible mistake. Of course I'll go in your place. So the next day, Ashen Peter put on the robes of the priest, and he went to visit the king. Well, the king set him down, and Ashen Peter said, hello, your majesty. And the king says, hello. And Ashen Peter says, let's just get this over with. And the king says, what? And he says, yeah, come on, dish it out. I can take it. In fact, I can go all night. And the king says, are you serious? And Ashton Peter said, yeah. Well, the king says, well, I find you very brave, but I'll tell you what. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. And if you get these 3 questions right, then I will give you all the gold you can carry home. If you get them wrong, I will give you what you're asking for. Ashton Peter says, sounds like a win-win to me. Let's go for it. So the king says, all right, here's question number 1. Question number 1, how far is it from east to west? Oh, said Ashton Peter, that's an easy one. See, I used to be a bell ringer until very recently, and so I know that the east starts in the morning at sunrise, and it sets in the west. So I'm going to say the distance from east to west is 1 day. Oh, said the king, oh, well, very good. Yeah, that's right. Very good, that's right. Yes, it is. He says, now I've got another question. These are getting a little bit harder. He says, you've come to my kingdom. You've come into my castle. You've seen what I'm wearing. You've seen my servants. How much, to the penny, am I worth? And Ashton Peter thought for a second. He says, well, you can see by my robe that I'm a priest, so I know that Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. Now, you're a very good and benevolent king, but you're not worth as much as Jesus. But you are a very good king, so I'm going to say 29 pieces of silver. Oh, said the king, very pleased. Yep, you nailed it. And so Ashton Peter got 2 out of 3. The king says, I've got one more question, and I'm afraid I don't know how you're ever going to get this question right. The king says, he says, priest. He says, priest, how much? He says, you've sat with me now. What am I thinking at this very moment? And Ashton Peter said, well, you think you're talking to a priest, but you're not. I'm Ashton Peter. The priest is back where I live now. And the king starts laughing and laughing and laughing. He says, you're Ashton Peter. He says, Ashton Peter, anytime I need counseling, will you come to my castle? And Ashton Peter says, yes. In fact, would you be on my council? Ashton Peter says, you know, I'd like to, but I'm so happy. I have a daughter. I just love where I live so much. I would rather just stay where I am. The king says, I understand. And he said, Ashton Peter, here's all the gold you can carry. And Ashton Peter says, well, it looks awful heavy, but it'll make you happy, I'll take it. So Ashton Peter loaded up with the gold, and the king says, now, Ashton Peter, when you get home, please send that priest back. I have some questions I want to ask him. So Ashton Peter loaded up the gold and started home, and you know what? He didn't make it home with that gold. He lost it somewhere. Of course, he put it somewhere and he forgot entirely about it. And I know some people in this room are going, I wonder where he left that gold. And some people are thinking, I wonder where that town is, where everyone's happy. And some of you are thinking, I already live in that town. I already live where I'm happy. And some of you are like the priest, you're not happy unless you're depressed. And actually, that priest did go to see the king, and they never did see him in town again. In fact, that priest is probably living unhappily ever after, wherever he is right now. And Ashton Peter, every once in a while, the king will say, Ashton Peter, I need your counsel. And Ashton Peter will go to the king, and the king will ask him questions, and Ashton Peter, every time, leaves with all the gold he can carry, which he loses on the way home to that place where everyone is happy, they don't know why, and they can't afford to find out. That's one I've always wanted to get to tell that. So the storytellers in olden days, and I'm thinking in Ireland where we started, in olden days they were the newspaper, the historian, the encyclopedia, the entertainment. They would come into your home, they were fed, and they were treated really, really well. And then at night, the neighbors would come over, the storyteller would tell the news of the day, and someone would ask, you know, who's president over there in America? And the storyteller would say, well, where did you leave off? And they would say, well, Lincoln. Well, now there's been 4 since then. And the storyteller would then catch them up on the news of the day. After the questions were answered, they would start with their big story. And it would usually start with, one day, there were 2 people named Adam and Eve. And they would get through the Bible, and about 4 days later, the storyteller would get to their town, where he would tell about their town. And at night, the storyteller, when the kids would go to sleep, would tell stories that the kids weren't supposed to hear. But of course, they woke up and they would peek from under beds. And one of my favorite storytellers is Eamon Kelly. And Eamon Kelly would tell these stories. He was an actual, they were called Shinachis, and they would go from town to town. And Eamon Kelly was an actual Shinachi, that when he was a young person, he would go from town to town as a storyteller. And he had two lines that I just always would love. He would start a story sometimes with, "Back in the day when geese went barefoot, as indeed they still do." And another one was, he would always wear a hat. And he said, "Back in my day, everyone always wore a hat. You had to wear a hat. It was back in the times we had more respect for the brain." And Eamon Kelly was one of my favorite tellers, and I remember he had a story that he would tell that would be one of those after-hours stories. And it was one of those storytellers, he would talk about being a Shinachi and go to someone's home, and then every once in a while, he would come in, and one time he went in, oh God, there was this brown bread cooking. Oh, and it smelled so good. And he went for a piece of brown bread, and the woman of the house slapped his hand and said, "No, that has to cool. You've got to let that cool. That's too early for that brown bread." Oh, he wanted a piece of that bread so bad. But he did what they said. He told his stories. And that night, when it got dark, it was time to go to bed. Well, in those days, you had the cradle for the child, but you had one bed, and everyone was going to climb into that bed. Well, the man of the house decided, well, I'm sleeping in between these two just so nothing untoward will happen in the night. So the father of the house slept between the two, and his wife was on one side, and everyone was on the other. And in the middle of the night, sure enough, the man had to go up and go outside, as Eamon said, to pay the Pope. I really don't know what that means, but I do know what that means. So the man got up and he went outside. Well, the wife turned to Eamon and said, "Now's your chance." And Eamon hopped up and cut himself a slice of brown bread. Sigmund Freud said, "Wherever I have been, a poet has been there first." There's an African saying, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. And it's true. I had a woman in a workshop one time say, if you don't tell your story, it will tell you. And it's true. We are creatures of story. I love what Nabokov said. He said, the first story didn't happen when the boy cried wolf. The first story happened when the boy cried wolf and there was no wolf. I love the Icelandic stories. I love them because the sagas are about regular, everyday people. And this was in the time people were writing about kings and queens. But in Iceland, it was just regular people. So that's who's in their sagas. And one of my favorite stories starts with this man, and he has a neighbor that no one likes. He's just despicable neighbor. And finally, he tries to keep neighborly. He knows someday you always will need your neighbor. You've got to be friends with your neighbors. But sure enough, his neighbor kills his servant. And okay, so he goes over to talk to the neighbor, and they get in a fight, and he ends up killing his neighbor. And what I love is he goes home, and he tells his mother, and he's heartbroken what he has done. But my favorite part is what his mother says. She says, "Son, you did the right thing, but more importantly, you told it really well." I love those Icelanders. Anyway, there's also a story, and it comes from Japan, and it was about a samurai and a storyteller. And they were the best two, and the emperor even knew it. These were probably the best two of their jobs ever. The best samurai and the best storyteller. So the emperor said, I'm going to pit these two against each other. I'm going to see who is the strongest, the storyteller or the samurai. Everyone from miles and villages around turned out in the arena to see who was the strongest. And they paired off, and they were looking at each other, and all of a sudden they said, "Go!" The samurai unsheathed his sword, and the storyteller said, "Once upon a time." The samurai sat down his sword and admitted defeat. Afterwards, his students were going, "What'd you do? All you had to do was slice his head off." And the samurai said, "You don't understand." He said, when he said, "Once upon a time," that's how my mother used to start stories. Back when we used to live by that creek, back when my dad was still alive. And I remember the blossoms were out in the spring. And I remember that creek, I remember the house so well. And all of a sudden, I realized I wasn't in the arena anymore, and that storyteller could have killed me anytime he wanted. Those are the ways stories can take us not only out of ourselves, but back into ourselves. Okay, this isn't on my list. Use of my right arm. I also suffer from post-traumatic stress. And so sometimes I deal with anger issues, sleep issues, pain, and it can get really bad. And I see a therapist and she says, she'll help me through these times. But one time she says, I want to try a form of therapy that deals with stories, because that's how your brain is wired. And so she had me actually walk through my motorcycle accident, but this time I missed the car and kept going. And for some reason, my anger issues dissipated. I slept that night. It was incredible what that did just by rearranging that story. So in my deep myth in my head, I missed the car, but I wake up, I still can't use my right arm. I wake up and I still know I was in that accident. So I'm living in a state of paradox. I'm living by having the accident and not having the accident. But luckily, I have stories to make a bridge between. And we are creatures of paradox. That's when we're our happiest. The word belong, okay, when you belong, that's when you're at your most happy, right? Belonging is actually a paradox. To be somewhere and to long to be somewhere else. To have a nest and vastness. To have both safety and risk. That's when we are our happiest. So as humans, we are at our best when we're in states of paradox. But to bridge those paradoxes, that's why we need stories, because then they can talk to each other and we can live in states of peace. Okay, back to the regular scheduled program. Here's another way to put it. I was watching Channel 2, I'm watching PBS, and they have Professor Leakey is on, and he's doing these diggings over in Africa. And he did this digging, and it was when people had just started to change from herbivores, so they were eating plants, to carnivores, because the Ice Age went out, and when the Ice Age went out, it wiped out their plants, and they had to become carnivores. And this is when we got our teeth, our canine teeth, our brains changed because we were eating more protein. All these things happened because we had to start following the herds instead of eating plants. And he said 3 things had to change for the survival of the human race. One was we had to develop new tools, of course, that went from plant harvesting to killing animals. The second was we had to develop language skills that would also fit with our changing new occupation. Third was, he couldn't figure it out. But he knew there was a third, but he couldn't find it. Finally, hundreds of miles from the original site, he did a digging and found his answer. There was a woman in the grave that had brittle bone disease. In other words, she had to be carried from site to site to site for hundreds of miles. And they had done, that's what they did. And then Leakey said he discovered what he considers the most important of the 3, and that is compassion. That our species cannot survive without compassion. We know we need each other to continue. Again, that's what stories do. They connect us, they put us in the same world, they make us realize that we are family. At some point we wondered, why are we here? Where do we go after life? What is the meaning of this life? And at that moment, rituals were tied to stories. The life and death of animals that we lived with and hunted. Later, when we got into the harvest, we learned going back to a plant-based, but this time we planted it ourselves. Agriculture came in, and there were gods now of harvest, of birth, of death, of warfare. War to protect our food and shelter and families, but also to protect our beliefs. The myths and the gods of the most powerful people are the myths and gods that moved on. Joseph Campbell said, every myth only lives within its community, and it's really true. Here's where I really learned this. I was over in Thailand. He said, you can't explain a myth unless it's by another myth. You can't explain it logically because it doesn't work. And this is where I learned it. I was in Thailand, and somebody there, somebody there was describing Christmas, and they said, yeah, Christmas in America, it's a bunch of people looking at a dead tree eating candy out of old socks. No. But in Thailand, this is, it's like, okay. So, you really can't describe a myth unless you with another myth. We give our lives value through our struggles, and our struggles voiced through our stories. We are hardwired to stories. In other words, we need trajectory and momentum, and we need our imaginations to create our possible futures. Our first stories. This is where don't worry, I'm getting to Washburn, and we will get to Adam and Eve. But the first stories, and I learned this, I was in the outback of Australia. I've had the great fortune of spending time in Australia, and I was with a group of indigenous Australians in the outback, and we're walking through the outback, and this man named Clem Cattard is walking with us. And I'm walking along with Clem. Oh, all of a sudden an emu runs by, this flightless bird, and it goes running by, and Clem goes, fast food. And so we're walking along, and he points to this mountain, and he said, and he even said, he pointed to the landscape, he goes, the landscape is our encyclopedia, it's our Bible, it's our supermarket, it's everything. And we come to this mountain, and it's Eagle Mountain. And in his story, he talked about the eagle and his nephews, the magpie and the crow, and how they tried to kill him. And then the eagle sought revenge. This was before birds had plumage. And he built a fire in the mountain. And the two, the magpie and the crow, were trapped in this fire. The magpie made it out, so he's only partially singed. That's why their plumage is black and white. And the crow never did get out, and so he was completely singed, and so the crow is black. And the eagle, this story, so he tells me this story, and it seems like a 5-minute story. There are 12 stories in that story. By that story, because of the eagle and the magpie and the crow being his nephews, you know by your totem who you can marry from that story. You know from where the eagle cried where you can find water. You know where there's shelter by that cave. You know all kinds of things through this simple 5-minute story. And over the years, that story, it's also a map on how you can walk through that area. And so by this simple story, there were all these different messages, all these clues into how to live. David Abram, one of my favorite writers, and one of you a great writer, this guy's amazing, he said, stories used to carry information, how to make a particular food, how to construct a tool you might need, and these were held in a song. The central character were often animals, and they were you would regularly encounter in this world a coyote, a raven, a spider, a wolf, but much more important is the stories often associated a particular place in the land where the events are believed to have happened. So you come across this particular site, say a cluster of trees, and it triggers a memory to the land, and in the sense of this memory, the story is triggered. This is one of my favorite lines. To push a traditionally oral people off their homeland is to literally push them out of their minds. Wow. The ancient Greeks took this another step. Aesop's fables, the stories that he took with animals to display human characteristics. One of my favorites, I love this turtle story I just came across. Okay, so this turtle was supposed to go to Zeus's wedding. Zeus was having his wedding, and the turtle was supposed to go. Well, the turtle was so happy at home, I don't know about you guys in Minnesota, man, when you're home. I can't believe so many people turned out. It's like when you're home, it's like, ah. And so the turtle was so happy, it's like, oh man. And so he missed Zeus's wedding. So Zeus said, where were you? Why weren't you at my wedding? And the turtle said, oh man, I was at home. It's so nice. I just love home so much. And Zeus said, you missed my wedding because you were at home. And the turtle goes, yeah. And Zeus said, all right, from now on, you carry your home on your back. Oh. So you will be my next wedding. What I love is, Zeus had just got married, and he already knows his wedding is not going to work. He said, you'll be at my next wedding. It's like, he already knows he's a goner. Anyway. But that is a turtle and his home on his back. The Greeks believed that a story worked like a loom, and that vertically ran the metaphor, horizontally ran the sequence, and where they came together, they wove their invisible threads for their cloaks of immortality. They also believed that spirit and breath were the same word. They were the same thing. So your breath was spirit. In other words, we inspire and we expire. So that their prayers, whenever you sang, that was spirit meeting thought and coming out. So every word you said was sacred. Every prayer was sung aloud. You never prayed in silence because that wouldn't put it to spirit. So every prayer was said aloud. And I mean, here's one of the prayers, really quick. This was from Homer. This is 860 BC to Artemis. I sing of Artemis, whose shafts of gold cheer on the hounds. The pure maiden over shadowy hills and windy peaks draws her golden bow, rejoicing in the chase. And when she has satisfied her heart, this huntress slackens her supple bow and goes to the great house of her dear brother Apollo, to the rich lands of Delphi, and there to order the lovely dance of the muses and the graces. There she hangs up her curved bow and her arrows and heads and leads the dances, gracefully arrayed, while they all utter their heavenly voice, both in thought and in deed. I mean, there is a prayer. I mean, and Artemis, this huntress, this unattainable woman. I mean, if she lived here in Wisconsin, there'd be a line around the block to get her in a blaze orange wedding dress. And so these prayers, these beautiful prayers, and one of my favorite gods is Hephaestus, who's the one god with disabilities, who's, as a child, his mother threw him off Mount Olympus. He landed and shattered his legs, drug himself down into Hades and created a forge. And with the Cyclops, he started making the arts. He started creating arrows that never missed, shields that could not be penetrated, jewelry that immediately won hearts. And Hephaestus, through his art, took himself out of hell, a god again. You have to realize this was back when bronze was first invented. So metallurgy, to be a metallurgist, to understand this god, I mean, he was the one who won wars. He was the one, and so this God with a disability literally took himself out of hell with his art. I love also that the Greeks, their gods always lived in paradise. Like Aphrodite, right? She's the most beautiful of all the gods. So Aphrodite's the most beautiful god. But people don't remember, she was always attended by her two handmaids, Shame and Desire. So wherever she went, there was Shame and Desire flanking the most beautiful god in the world. This was also the time literature was evolving. Plato finally wrote things down, but Socrates would never. That's why Plato has to write what Socrates says, because Socrates wouldn't write, and you know why? He felt if you wrote something down, your intelligence was leaving the body. This is why I wonder what you would think of cell phones. According to David Abram, the early Hebrew texts, they couldn't write vowels because the early Hebrews also believed that spirit lived on breath, and it would be sacrilege. And it just so happened that God's name was all vowels, so it never could be written. That's why in the early Bibles, God's name is always epithets. It's always the description of God and not the word of, not the name of God, because that would be sacrilege to actually put that in a written form. They were very careful to keep the spiritual and the physical separate things. The other thing, though, that with the alphabet, Christianity could travel. We finally had a God that could travel. A God didn't have to have Mount Olympus. A God didn't have to have a rock or a tree. A God could now live in your heart. And so this is the importance of one of the things about Christianity is it could go to other lands, which made it special. The other thing was Christianity wasn't a series of logic. It was burning bushes. It was great big fish. It didn't revolve around logic. It revolved around emotion. And that's why Jesus picked this up with his parables and why they were so powerful. He knew belief was lodged in stories, not in logic. And Aristotle even talks about this. Aristotle lined up the three forms of rhetoric in his Poetics. He says it's logic, morality, and emotion. And which one carries the most weight? Everyone goes, oh, logic. No, it's emotion. Carries the day every time. My friend Matt Sanford says, we don't discover the truth, we let it in. Truth needs to be recognized. And if you know that, you don't discover truth, you recognize truth. And it's really true. And that's why Jesus with the loaves and the fishes, his stories, it's why Lazarus, Jesus went down to raise up Lazarus from the dead. But this is a thing in the story that people don't remember. Jesus had to take the shroud of death off of Lazarus before he could raise him from the dead. And the reason was, he knew as long as Lazarus thought he was dead, he would be dead. But when he pulled off the shroud, Lazarus knew he wasn't dead. It's just, every once in a while I get to work with guys that in prison, and they come out and they say, they always issue the same suit. So you always can tell a guy from this prison that comes out because they all have the same suit. And they always say, get out of that suit as fast as you can, because while you're in that suit, you're still in prison. There's this great folk tale about a man goes into town and once a month to buy supplies. And he's in town and he finds a mirror. And he's never seen a mirror before. And he looks in and he thinks it's a picture of his father. Oh, I gotta buy this is a picture of my dad. So he brings it home and he puts it under the bed. And a week later, his wife is under the bed and she finds this mirror. She doesn't know what a mirror is either. She looks in, oh, it's a picture of a woman. Oh, obviously the woman her husband is having an affair with in town. This looks just like the kind of hussy he would fall for. So a big fight breaks out, a frying pan, when all of a sudden a neighbor goes, no, it's a mirror, it's a looking glass. And now they're in love again, and she goes and gets a bag of ice for his head. But we have to remember that we, just like the people in the story, we don't believe what we see what we believe. And I think we have to remember that, especially, and we always say this, but especially these days. It's like truth and lies were skinny dipping one day. Lying talked truth into going skinny dipping. So truth and lies are in the pond when lies snuck out and put on truth's clothing and ran away. And that's why, to this day, lies walks around wearing truth's clothing. And truth climbed out, but no one could handle the naked truth. There's this great Walter Benjamin, his name is, this amazing storyteller who actually lived back at the time in Germany. He was Jewish, he was in Germany, he was caught, and he was killed. But before he was killed, he wrote so much on storytelling that is so moving and beautiful and true. He maintained that storytellers fell into two camps, seafarers and farmers. Seafarers collected experiences on their voyages and brought them back, but farmers collected experiences at home. And this is what separated the two forms of storytelling. The storytellers told their stories and were filled with counsel and wisdom. One thing, like Nabokov said, it had to contain something useful. Useful in this case consisted of a warning, something practical, or a proverb or maxim. And in every case, the storyteller was counsel to his readers. And this is what I love what Benjamin says. Wisdom in a world of lies is subversive. He also felt the ability to exchange experience was the heart of storytelling. Storytelling is transforming, enlightening, and liberating. Even in amusement, the storyteller converts experience into wisdom and knowing laughter. Laughter. Okay, this is where I want to move. Humor. Humor is so important to storytelling. This is why I use humor, because when we laugh together, we are family. I use it early on in stories because when you crack up with somebody, you are already, so I started thinking, okay, what is our humor? And up here, Oli and Lena. I started thinking of Lena. I tell these all over the world. Ireland. I tell Oli and Lena jokes, they lose it. They think they're the funniest things. Okay, here's one that I saw the other day. Lena got to be a waitress in the local diner, and she was just starting out being a waitress. And somebody came in and sat down and said, I'd like to ask you about the menu, please. And she said, the menu, please, is none of your business. Okay, we know about Oli a bit. Okay, anyway. Oh yeah, what's the other? Oli and Lena are sitting in the living room, and Oli answers the phone. And Lena hears him go, how should I know? I live 3,000 miles from the ocean. And he hangs up, and Lena says, who is that? And Oli says, I don't know, some guy asking if the coast was clear. So we have, in our community, we have jokes, we have things that crack us up, and humor is really, really important. And it is in all cultures. Tricksters and fools and clowns are essential. I love fools. In fact, I was reading about on the Red Lake, Gerald Visner wrote, and that the Anishinaabe had what they called irony dogs. And they were dogs that were trained to bark when there was no irony in the room. And I love that idea that, again, to create paradox. And that's what a fool does. A fool brings something to the world that doesn't exist. In the most serious places, the fool would be the one that would make it funny. And the fool also is the one that always thwarts the king, just like the Ashen Painter. I mean, the fools, and there's this great fool from Sufi lore called Nesruddin. And Nesruddin is one of my favorite characters because he's a wise farmer. And he's working in his field, and a man comes by on a horse, and he says, "Farmer, what's this town like up ahead?" And Nesruddin says, "What's the town like where you come from?" And the man says, "Oh, it's terrible. It's full of cutthroats and thieves. It's a horrible place." And Nesruddin says, "That's what you'll find up ahead." And another traveler comes by and he says, "Farmer, what's this town like up ahead?" And Nesruddin says, "What's the town like where you're from?" He says, "Oh, it's so beautiful. It's peaceful. It's wonderful. The people are amazing." And Nesruddin says, "That's what you'll find up ahead." He's always bringing to a situation the wisdom. And a lot of times he is the fool. Like one time he goes out to find a wife, and he tells his friend, "I'm going to find the perfect woman." So he's gone for 2 years, and he finally comes back, and his friend says, "Did you find the perfect woman?" And Nesruddin said, I looked, but every place I went, I found a woman, but there was always a small flaw. So I would move on to the next. Finally, I found a place that everyone was so beautiful, so wonderful, and I found her. I found the perfect woman. And his friend said, "And did you marry her?" And Nesruddin said, "No, unfortunately, she was looking for the perfect man." So there's the fools and the clowns and the tricksters. Fools have a foot in 2 worlds, like Nesruddin. Clowns have 2 feet in another world. So Shakespeare really delineates. If you're a Shakespeare fan, you can tell how to play somebody by if he calls you a fool or a clown. Like Lear's fool, you would take counsel from Lear's fool, but a clown you would never take counsel because they have 2 feet in another world. You learn from clowns by watching them. You learn from fools by listening to them. Other stories, ghost stories. Ghost stories are how we lived with death as we went on, how we lived in the world between this world and the next. And my favorite ghost stories come from Japan. And one of my favorite ghost stories I just read, and I'll tell you the title at the end because the whole story changes. And it's about a man who was a murderer. And he was this murderer in this town, and they finally captured this man. And the samurai of the town was ready to cut his head off. And before the samurai cut his head off, the man said, "When I die, I'm going to haunt this town." And everyone, whoa, because they knew this guy, and they knew what he said was true. And he said, "I'm going to come back as a ghost, and every single one of you is going to see me in your dreams. I'm going to haunt the hell out of this place." And everyone, whoa. And the samurai saw everyone afraid, and he said, is that really true to the man? And the man says, "Oh, yeah, you're going to see." And the samurai said, "Well, if that's true, when I cut your head off, you will take your head, roll it over, and bite that stump over there." The man said, "Oh, you're going to say, I will bite that stump, and you will see that I will haunt this place forever." Oh, the people said. The samurai cut his head off. The head slowly rolled over to the stump and bit it. Everyone, "Oh, no, we're going to be haunted for the rest of our lives." The samurai said, "No, don't worry." And they said, "Well, a year went by, no haunting. Another year, no haunting." Finally, years later, the people said, "How did you know? How did you know he wouldn't haunt us?" And the samurai said, "Because I placed the idea to bite that stump, and that's what he left this world with. He stopped listening to, I want to haunt this place, and all he thought about was biting that stump." Well, the name of that story is Diplomacy. Okay, other stories. Love stories. We have to have love stories. Love stories are where we give us hope. I have a friend who's a psychiatrist who said, he works with guys coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and he said, the one sentence that has saved more lives than any other is, "You will find love again." And it's really true. The ability to find love again, that idea of hope, that idea of there's always love waiting for us down the line. One of my absolutely favorite stories comes from Ireland, and it's an old folk tale from Ireland that it's this young man, and he goes to a dance with his buddies, and he sees this girl, and his heart he's so in love with her. And they dance, and they dance, and they move as one across the dance floor. And his heart is just with her. And he says, here's the Irish. I learned this from my friend Claire Murphy. The Irish, when you ask someone to marry you, you say, do you want to be buried with my people? So he decides he wants her to be buried with his people. So he brings her home to meet his father. And his father and him and her, they're sitting on the porch and they're having the time of their lives, when all of a sudden his father goes, see that stone down there, son? You're a strapping young man. What do you say? Can you go down and move that stone? And the boy had never thought of this. He said, well, I think so. And he didn't want to disappoint this girl who already won his heart. So he goes down and he's trying to move the stone. He's trying to move the stone. And the father up on the porch turns to the girl and says, I don't think he's going to move it. Is that the kind of man you want to marry? And the boy looked up on the porch and she was gone. It took years to go by. I mean, it so crushed him. But his friends finally talked him to go to the dance. And they said, just stand in the corner. You don't even have to dance. You got to get out of the house. You've been moping for years. So the boy went to the dance. And while he was standing there, he heard this laughter. And he looks over and there's this fiery red hair. And this just laughing, this girl laughing. He thought, okay. I can't believe it. And they danced, and once again they moved as one, and her laughter was like music to him. And he came home with her again. He told his dad, he figured his dad would never do that again. Sure enough, his father points to the stone. He goes, son, remember that stone down there? You're a little bit older now. You're a little bit stronger and bigger. I bet you can move that. Go on down there and move that stone. The boy goes down there and goes, I'm going to move it for her. I can do it for her. And he gets down there and he tries to, he can't get it to move. He can't get it to move. All of a sudden he hears laughter up on the porch. He turns and she's gone. Years later, his friends finally tell him to go back. And they just go, don't worry. We know you're going to be a bachelor. We know. Just go back. And sure enough, once again, he finds someone and she just wins his heart. And he brings her home. And he knows what's going to happen. He says, I don't care. She's the one for me. And he brings her home, and his dad says, can you move that stone? And he thinks, if I can move that stone for anyone, it's for her. And he goes down to that stone, and he can't get it to go. And he can't get it to go, and sure enough, it's not going to move. All of a sudden, he sees a shadow above him. And he looks up, and it's the girl. And she bends down between the two of them. They move the stone. From the porch, he hears his dad say, there, son, that's the one for you. Folk tales, love stories, fairy tales, like Ash and Peter. Jack Sight says, fairy tales are for us to live in a world not of our making. A fairy tale provides us with tools to cope with a changing world, and the best tales help us understand the dirty little corners of the world. I think of that because my favorite fairy tale, when I was a kid, there were two kinds of fairy tales I hated and fairy tales I hadn't heard yet. When you're a guy with a disability, it always ends up bad for the guy with a disability, right? So I just hated fairy tales. And then my grandmother told me a fairy tale about a man who had two pots, and he would bring them to the river and fill them with water and bring them home. Well, one day, a crack developed in one of the pots. And as time went on, that crack widened until by the time the man got home, all the water had leaked out of the pot. So finally, the pot turns to the man. This is the days when pots and pans could talk. As indeed they still do. And the man turned to the pot, or the pot turned to the man and said, please, you take me to the river every day. Every day that water leaks out. Please, replace me with another pot. The man turned to the pot and said, look down the trail. The pot looked down the trail, and on the side of the trail with the pot that didn't have a crack, it was craggy and rocky and barren. But on the side of the path with the pot with the crack, wildflowers grew. And the man said, every day you water those flowers. Every day you make my difficult journey beautiful. I think I'll keep you. And so those were the stories that I got. And I think that's why I became a storyteller, was because I knew that a story can change with the people and change with the times, with the fairy tales. There's one more fairy tale that I wanted to bring up, heroes' journeys. And the reason I wanted to bring up a hero journey is because heroes are journeys. They are the ones that they live at home. They start out as a farmer, someone that lives at home. An invitation comes. Sometimes it's something that threatens, like Beowulf. Grendel comes to town, and Beowulf has to go kill Grendel. Something comes that changes the world, and the hero has to go and spend everything they've got, all the gifts that they've been given through life. The things most dear to them are usually lost. I tell people, in stories are paradox, especially hero's journeys. If you want to tell a hero story, you have to tell what was lost in order for the hero to attain victory. If it's a tragedy, you have to discover what was found for that person to lose everything. And so hero's journeys are really important because now we're in Washburn. Now I've got us here, and our heroes had to come over with this, and they turned into, most of the time, they turned into tall tales. Our jack tales went from kings and queens to landlords and to landowners. I love especially the Brer Rabbit stories in the South. Brer Rabbit, they came over, they were the jack tales, they were the tales of Africa that came over with the people from Africa. But they were in this rabbit, Brer Rabbit, which is Brother Rabbit, and they were the heroes that came from Africa. And the Disney movie is really wrong because they have some of the characters that are duped and fooled as black characters in the Disney version. Well, that wouldn't have been in a Brer Rabbit story. The characters that they duped and they fooled were always the landowners and the masters of the time. And so Brer Rabbit was always fooling the hierarchy, just like they did in Europe, just like they did in Africa. And so that's when Brer Rabbit says, "Don't throw me in the briar patch. Whatever you do, don't throw me in the briar patch." And of course the fox goes, "Okay, I'll watch." And he throws him in the briar patch, the worst place for anybody else but Brer Rabbit. And Brer Rabbit then makes his escape, once again, duping the landlord, duping the master. We had stories here. One thing that I love about this area is our heroes could be mining heroes, they could be John Henry, they could be lake heroes. I love the stories of Lake Superior. Gitche Gumee. I mean, that lake, 1/10 of the world's fresh water supply, we didn't find its bottom until 15 years after we walked on the moon. I mean, that lake is legend. One of my favorite stories from that lake was the first boat that went across, the Griffin, and it came across all the lakes. It's the one that brought like Father Hennepin and all these guys from Europe. Well, they got on a storm on Lake Superior, and they're going on the storm, and I love what the report from the ship was. The navigator was screaming on deck, "Please, God, don't let me die on a lake." I mean, like the most humiliating thing that can happen to him. All the shipwrecks, all the legends of this lake are lumberjack stories. I wanted to get to lumberjack stories because superstitions in the world of lumberjacks, like sleep with your head downstream, or else then your thoughts will pour into you and not out of you. Never sharpen an axe on Sunday, or it will cut you on Monday. Some wouldn't build with poplars because it was supposedly the tree they used to crucify Jesus. Skid Row got its name because of logging skids digging trenches in the streets where lumberjacks summered. Rough areas of town, the young men in their 20s, the flop houses where they said they caught a case of pants rabbits. One of my favorite stories from a logging camp was if it was 20 below, you didn't have to go out and you didn't have to work because it was too cold. And they said that one time the foremen were meant to be the meanest people, and the foreman walked out and held up a thermometer. It was like 35 below, and he lit a match underneath the thermometer, and when it got over 20 below, he said, "Let's get to work." This is where Paul Bunyan comes from. And Paul Bunyan, I just wanted to read what Carl Sandburg wrote a bit about Paul Bunyan. Who made Paul Bunyan? Who gave the birth to this myth? Who joked him life as the master lumberjack? Who fashioned him forth as an apparition, easing the hours of men among axes and trees and saws and lumber? The people, the bookless people, they made Paul. And they had him alive long before he got into books for those to read. He grew up in shanties around hot stoves of winter, among socks and mittens drying, and the smell of tobacco smoke and the roar of laughter mocking the outside weather. And at some of Paul came overseas in wooden bunks below decks and sailing vessels. And some of Paul is as old as the hills and as young as the alphabet. and I love some of the stories that they tell. And one of my favorite ones was, one year when it rained from St. Patrick's Day to 4th of July, Paul Bunyan got disgusted because his celebration of the 4th of July was spoiled. He dived into Lake Superior and swam to where a solid pillar of water was coming down. He dove underneath the pillar and swam up and climbed down, and then the rain stopped. Paul Bunyan appeared from the water and said, "I turned the damn thing off." So we had this superhero creature, Paul Bunyan, and some of our other heroes of this area. And not just of the area of the people that came over, all these myths, all these legends, these religions, but the language and the people that were already here, it was rich with stories. Before, the Anishinaabe language is 87% verbs, so it is built for stories. It is built to keep moving. It is built to be a living language. I was talking to Winona Leduc, she's a pal of mine, and the other day she reminded me, what happens to the wolf happens to the people. And it's really true, the animal stories that connect us. And we go back to those stories. I think this is what I want to finish with. The why we tell a story is as important as what and how we tell. Why do we need to tell a story? It's like, why does a story have to come? Why does it have to come in life at the time that it comes in life? I know that the rune stone in the center of Minnesota, they discovered this rune stone, the story that goes around it. I think the why of that story is even more important than the how and the what of that story. It's a time when the white people of that area really wanted and needed to lay claim to that area. They needed to have some kind of heritage with that land. So they created or found, or it exists or not, but it's the why of that rune stone that to me is as important as the how and the what. And then I just want to finish with a story from here that I think is a legend of our time. So I thought, what is the legend that came over with us? What were the ones that created, and what are ones of today? And I can't help but go to Edmund Fitzgerald. I can't help going to the legend of that story. That story is so much greater than itself. That story is greater than the lake, the people. It really is a legend of that lake, and it really does live through us in our DNA from this time on. I think of the stories that are here from Lori Otis, Warren, Nelson, Tom Mitchell, Jan Lee. I think of my mom telling the stories of this trail out here, of the town, of the history of this town. This is us stepping into the pantheon of storytelling. They say that the person that told you the story sits on your right shoulder, and they tell you this. The person that told them sits on their story back to time when it began. And I believe that's true. And I believe we add to the pantheon with what we put into each story. And those are some of the people from this area that really do. I think this area is so rich in stories, not only the stories that came here, but the stories that exist here now. I'm very proud of this area for adding to that pantheon. And so I want to finish with an Icelandic toast, because I started with an Icelandic story. Give praise at the end of the day. A woman at her pyre, a bride at her wedding, a weapon that is tired. The ice that is crossed, the care that is lost, the love that is found, the beer that is down.